I'd like to welcome fellow AAKP board member and chair of policy and global affairs, Paul Conway. Paul is a friend, a fellow kidney patient who has been managing his condition for 47 years. He has experience on home dialysis and is a 27-year transplant recipient. Paul has been recognized for his advocacy work with several national awards, including the American Society of Nephrology's President's Award. His public service includes roles in 4 U.S. presidential administrations, including Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Labor, and 5 presidential transitions. Oof. He has represented patient concerns across multiple federal and nonprofit committees and boards related to kidney health, including as chair of the FDA's Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, the American Board of Internal Medicine's Nephrology Specialty Board, and the National Institutes of Health's Kidney Precision Medicine Project. Paul, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for your dedication to kidney patients around the country, and also your outstanding work advocating for veterans and their families and for the legal rights and benefits that they've earned through their service. I'd like to begin the first panel today on a very important issue to kidney transplant patients. For those who have paid attention to organ transplantation issues over the past 2 years, there's been a tremendous discussion about what's right and what's wrong with the American transplant system. Some of that information has been hubris, some of it has been factual. But for those of us who are organ transplant recipients, or for those who are on the organ transplant waiting list, one of the biggest questions that we have is, what is our nation doing to make certain that those who have organ transplants keep them, and that when we transplant somebody in the United States, they have the opportunity and the chance to keep that organ as long as possible. This is very important because what it involves are the drugs that we take for immunosuppression, and it also involves those remedies that we have in order to protect ourselves from the greater vulnerabilities that we face because we are transplant patients and we have difficulties maintaining great health. So without further ado, we're very honored to have a good friend and solid ally, Dr. Ken Newell, who's a professor of surgery. He leads the transplant program at Emory University. He has been a long-time and passionate advocate for the next generation of transplant medicine. It's a complicated topic, but it is one where status quo medicine is simply not the best that America can do. And Dr. Newell has been pushing this issue hard. We're very pleased to have him with us between his surgeries. Our other panelist is Jonathan Haydak. And Jonathan is an absolute gem. He is a PhD student at the Carl Icahn School of Medicine in New York. He's an AAKP board member. And for our audience, you should know this, 4 years ago on World Kidney Day, Jonathan got a living donor transplant from his sister. He's a longtime patient advocate and just an outstanding individual. Our third guest is new to AAKP, but not new to the issues that we face. A longtime patient advocate and champion for innovation, science, and research, Dana Dayton. Dana joins us from the Melanoma Research Alliance. And just as importantly, she's a leading voice in PASS. PASS is a coalition. It's the name for the Public Access to Sunscreen. And one of the reasons why we have Dana with us, and we're so fortunate that we do, is kidney transplant recipients face their 250 times greater risk for skin cancer because of the immunosuppression we face. And so while it's tough enough maintaining a transplant, sometimes it's even tougher trying to mitigate the different consequences we face because of status quo medicines. And Dana, we are very fortunate to have you with us. So we will begin, and our discussion, the formal title of this panel, is Opportunities and Barriers in the Advancement of the Next Generation of Transplant Drugs and Other Innovations for Transplant Health, how the U.S. Food and Drug Administration decisions impact kidney transplant recipients, because many of the issues that we're dealing with go directly to the FDA. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and ask our good friend, Doc, go right ahead.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to thank the AAKP for allowing me to participate in this discussion. I think I've been in transplant now around 40 years. When you look at the therapeutic landscape, in transplantation, I think it's fair to say it hasn't changed much over the past several years. This is very different than it was when I grew up in the field in the late 80s and 90s, where there were so many new therapeutics being developed, you thought it would be hard to do enough clinical trials. There weren't enough patients to test these. This is very different. The drugs that we use today as baseline immunosuppression are essentially unchanged over the past 20 years. Why is this important? It's important because if we want to improve, you can't keep using the same tools. You need new tools. I think the major barrier to developing new therapeutics in transplantation is the current endpoint for clinical trials. So every new agent undergoes clinical trials to assess the safety and benefit to the patient. The endpoint that we used is nearly 4 decades old. It's a composite of patient survival, graft loss, and the rate of acute rejection. When that endpoint was developed in the 80s, the rate of acute rejection was 90%, and the survival of a transplanted kidney was less than 50% at a year. So those were targets that were easy to impact. You didn't have to study tens of thousands of people to see a difference. If you look at those rates now, patient survivals maybe 97, 98%, graft survival 95%, rejection rates are single digits. That's a great success. But using that tool, you can see it's hard to show an improvement, right? You would have to have thousands and thousands and thousands of patients to show a benefit if you could. And that benefit, given the good outcomes of the year, would be, maybe statistically significant, but not necessarily significant in the life of a patient. If I say, I've taken your rejection rate or your rate of rejection, which isn't a thing that causes kidney loss necessarily, from 8% to 6%, you'd say that's great, but I was looking for more. And what we've heard, as the short-term outcomes have improved dramatically, people now are able to focus on long-term outcomes. And they're saying, at 10 years, at 15 years, at 20 years, how am I doing? Yeah, I want the kidney to be surviving, but I also want to be engaged in life with my family, with work. I want a normal life. And I would put it to you that the endpoint of death, graft loss, and rejection at 1 year doesn't really predict those things. And so using that tool, you have to have the correct target or the correct measuring tool to achieve the end you want. So if you want good long-term outcomes, as I've alluded to, you need a new tool. And we just don't have anything right now that does that. When you look at why companies aren't developing drugs in transplant, almost all the drugs used in transplant, immunomodulatory agents, can be used in other diseases like autoimmunity. There, the endpoints are much clearer and it's much easier to develop the drug. So, if you're a company and you have a choice of a easier measure or a harder measure, you're going to go with the easier measure. And I think it's up to the transplant community to propose tools that will bring development back into transplantation. The last drug, as an example, to be approved, the last novel drug to be approved in transplant was approved after nearly a decade of study with thousands and thousands of patients, long follow-ups, and that was in 2011. So you can see we're not evolving. If you look at the development of new agents in cancer or autoimmunity, it far, far, far outpaces us. And then it gives patients with those diseases much better outcomes. So we need new therapeutics. The barriers are current endpoint. And what are we doing about that? It was probably 7 or 8 years ago, the American Society of Transplantation and the American Society of Transplant Surgeons formed the Transplant Therapeutics Consortium. The goal of this was to partner with pharmaceutical companies and regulatory authorities and patients to try to come up with a new endpoint. It does no good to say we don't like the current endpoint, and people will say, well, what's better? And what's better when you speak to the FDA is not, I think this would be better. You need something that's data-driven, that you can show them that the tool is safe and it's going to do what you want and will provide a benefit. The Paris Transplant Group developed a tool called the iBox. Don't ask me how they got that name. But it's a composite of 4 measures that are all known to impact kidney health in the long term. It's the eGFR, many of you are familiar with that term, the histology, how the kidney looks on biopsy, the presence of an immune response measured by donor-specific antibodies, and proteinuria, all measures of kidney health. It then integrates those mathematically into an algorithm. And the beauty of this is you can assess that at 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever you want, and it's a very accurate predictor of long-term outcome. So the other problem for companies is if you want to do a study, in cancer, no one's doing 10 or 15-year studies, right? But if we want better 10-year outcomes, you have two choices. You need something that early on predicts a long-term outcome, or you need to do a long-term study. No one's going to do a study following hundreds of patients for 10 years. It's just not feasible. So we need an early predictor of long-term outcomes, and the iBox is exactly that. With this, you could then say, we will take a 1-year measure, predict 5-year or 7-year or 10-year outcomes, and the FDA has an accelerated approval pathway which would allow you to do this. The other benefit of this is the current studies are all done with what's called non-inferiority endpoints. You do your 5-year or 10-year study with hundreds and hundreds of patients, and at the end I can say, I've got a drug that's every bit as good as the same drug combination we've been using for 2 decades. Not very compelling. The iBox would actually allow you, if the therapeutic agent worked, to show superiority. The accelerated approval pathway allows the company to introduce the drug into the marketplace where patients can get it, while it does that long-term follow-up to prove that the iBox was actually accurate in this. So we've been working for, as I say, many years with the FDA through part of a private-public partnership where they assign a liaison to the group, and the group is composed of pharmaceutical companies, academics, society leadership, and working with the FDA to move this forward. And it's been, honestly, an arduous process with many questions. No one wants to get it wrong, I understand that. But we're proposing this be used together with the current endpoint. So in my mind, there's very little risk because we have to satisfy the current endpoint, which I would see mostly now as the safety endpoint, and then the iBox, which is the efficacy endpoint. So I'm glad to say that this has been a long and winding road with many stops and starts, but just recently FDA approved the qualification plan, which is the second step in the final approval. So having been at this, as I say, for many years, I think we are probably within 18 months of getting a final opinion from the FDA. The problem with this is if, for whatever reason, the FDA doesn't see this as an advantage for the field, I don't see anything happening for the next decade because there is no other data set, there are no other tools as far as surrogate endpoints for studies. So I think this is a really pivotal moment, and I can't thank Paul and the AAKP enough. I would say that this project was at risk of not progressing. And it was the strong voice of patients like Paul, like Kevin Fowler in the audience, like Karen Hanberg from Lightbulb, that really, I think, resurrected this project by emphasizing to the FDA that this is important to patients, that this isn't just something that can be kind of backtabled because there's some risk. So I'll stop there and I'll look forward to the discussion, but I do want to thank the AAKP because I think we have an opportunity here that will be decided in the next year or two to really advance the field in terms of bringing new therapeutics back. And we're not going to improve long-term outcomes for patients without new tools.
Thank you very much, Dr. Newell. And for those who are watching, I want you to know this, that nearly a year ago, FDA had a public meeting on transplant drugs and on this very issue. It was one of multiple meetings they've had over the past decade. However, the lack of intensity we felt as patients should be noted, and so we raised our voice. Over 900 patients registered for that FDA workshop, and the room size, FDA had to keep changing it. And then eventually they had to cut off the registration because they got to max capacity. It's a timely and relevant issue, but we fully intend to impart our sense of urgency to the FDA process. And part of that urgency comes from patients like Jonathan Haydak. Jonathan, why don't you go ahead and give us your perspective on what Doc has just talked about from the standpoint of a researcher and also as a patient.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, and I apologize if I repeat some of the points that were just gone over, but maybe they bear repeating. So I was diagnosed with a rare form of rapidly progressive and crescentic glomerulonephritis when I was 22. Started dialysis a year later. I spent 3 years on dialysis. I did both in-center hemo and peritoneal dialysis at home. And then in 2019, I received a living donor kidney transplant from my sister. Around the same time as my transplant, I actually ended up pivoting my career and switched from chemical engineering to studying kidney disease. And so now I'm at New York City at Mount Sinai, where I'm currently a fifth-year PhD student and probably graduating next year. I like to joke that I got kidney failure at the right time, as it happened at an inflection point in the CKD space, where after years of very little progress on therapies, we suddenly had a bunch of new options: SGLT2 inhibitors, non-steroidal MRAs, endothelium antagonists, complement inhibitors, new calcineurin inhibitor, and also many other promising therapies in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. On the other hand, though, this momentum hasn't transferred over into the field of kidney and other solid organ transplants. Like was just discussed, the last really novel and new anti-rejection medication was belatacept, which was approved in 2011. I think, again, part of the problem here is the reliance on 1 year and 5-year allograft survival rates in centers to maintain their certification and maintain their funding. And in fact, even when it comes to the 1-year allograft survival and composite outcomes, there's a few publications out there showing that we're really good at them. We basically maximized what we're going to get. But, you know, I just had my 5-year transplant anniversary earlier this year, and I'd like to have my transplant for many more years. One of the things that concerns me is all of the side effects of my anti-rejection medications. Their neurotoxicity, cardiovascular toxicity, metabolic alterations, cancer risk. And my least favorite, the infamous TAC shake, right? I found that actually in my day-to-day job, there are just certain techniques that are impossible for me to do in the lab. And if you look at it, there's a good case to be made that better long-term outcomes in transplant patients recently are more likely attributable to advances in drugs for cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other antimicrobials. Right. Currently, we don't have any therapies for targeted immunosuppression. So for somebody like me, that means that I have a lower tolerance for pathogens than most other people. And so I'll give you a few examples of real consequences of this. During 4th of July a few years ago, I visited some friends. We went to the beach. On the way home, we went to a farmer's market, and we bought some milk. Terrible idea. Turned out the milk was not pasteurized. I ended up getting violently sick for 3 weeks with a parasite called Cryptosporidium. The next summer, I mysteriously ended up with a blood infection, no good explanation as to why, and had to stay in the hospital for several days. This past Halloween, though, I had a syncope. So I was standing up, I got lightheaded all of a sudden, and then I went down. I ended up staying at the hospital overnight for observation, got referred to a cardiologist, and so now I have to wear a heart monitor for a month. I'm actually wearing it right now, and I have some follow-up imaging studies. And I think for me, this was a wake-up call for the potential cardiovascular risks post-transplant and other side effects in general. And right, well, I'm still relatively young, I'm 31. My body has had the cumulative burden of 3 years on dialysis along with 5 years of exposure to post-transplant medications. When I was in the hospital, I joked that I was already a renal patient. I didn't want to become a cardio-renal patient. I was being serious, though. And as I was in the waiting room for the cardiologist's office for my visit, I ran into another employee at Mount Sinai who I see a lot. And he actually asked me what I was doing there. I told him I had a kidney transplant and I was getting some heart issues checked out. And he told me you would never know that by looking at me, but that's the reality of many chronic diseases and illnesses. Right? So I'm 31 right now, like I said, and it's likely that I'll need another kidney transplant in the future. And that hopefully I'll have to take anti-rejection medications for many decades. But as I look towards the future as a patient, I would like to have better options and medications. Unfortunately, in this risk-averse space, the incentives, both regulatory and financially, for companies to invest in trials just aren't there. The current primary endpoints for trials, like were discussed, they're basically maxed out. Any new therapy would require non-inferiority trials, and even at this point, better outcomes at 1 year don't provide a convincing argument that they're going to lead to better long-term outcomes. And why would a doctor choose to do something new when you already have something that's been around for 20 years or more? One final point I would like to make is that I stand here representing a significant financial investment by the federal government stemming from my time on dialysis and my transplant. I'd like to keep my kidneys as long as possible, returning on this investment by staying a working, productive, and tax-paying member of society. I would like the government and agencies like the FDA to promote policies that help me do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And we salute your sister and your family and everything that you do in the field of research, but also especially for advocacy and being able to bring your story and put a special focus on issues like this and how you fight to stay in the workforce and to take care of your organ. Now I'd like to move over to Dana Dayton. And Dana, I'm very interested in the efforts that you have done through the Melanoma Research Alliance and also through the Public Access to Sunscreen Coalition, because you've heard how important maintaining health is. And I know that's true for so many Americans, but especially those who have a higher likelihood of exposure to cancer. So if you could give us some insights on your collaborations and your hopes for change in the sunscreen space.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is really interesting conversation. Paul, as you know, I'm rather new to the Melanoma Research Alliance, but am very happy to be working with them and be part of the past coalition. I don't have much experience in kidney health, though I have worked with the FDA a lot on esophageal cancer drugs, so I understand, the priority needs that there are and the effort that it takes to get new drugs through, testing and approvals and things like that. And I really, admire all of the work that you're doing. From the MRA perspective, our job is to end suffering and death caused by melanoma. So we do that through education, prevention, and research. We work really hard to find cutting edge researchers who are, taking some of the hardest problems like treatment resistance and rare melanomas and really trying to find pathways to better treatment so that people can live longer and, with a better quality of life. But of course, we want to get out in front of all of that with preventative ideas. And that's where sunscreen comes in. And that's why we're really happy to be part of PASS because, the best prevention only works if people use it, if it's accessible, if it's comfortable, relevant, all of those things to their lifestyle. And we all know in different aspects of our life, if things don't work for us, even if they're inexpensive or accessible, sometimes it doesn't matter. It has to work for everybody. And so we know that sunscreen, while it's ubiquitous in all of our stores, it's not always well loved or part of everybody's best, habits when they should be using it. So we try to educate people that, you don't just have to, or you shouldn't just have to think about using it when you're out at the beach or at the pool. You need to use it, every day in all aspects of your life, whether, you're driving around town, if you're on an airplane, at a nail salon, it's all extremely important. But then, what we also try to help people understand is that there are different types of sunscreen, and some might work better for others. Some might be more comfortable with the mineral-based versus the chemical-based. And so we do try to help people understand the differences. But as you alluded to, there are other options in other parts of the world that may be preferable to people here too. Lighter, easier to use sunscreens, that just don't feel as heavy and as much of a burden to put on. And so we are really committed to working with PASS and trying to get, more options passed through the FDA. It's been a long time since there have been any new approvals for sunscreens. And I think the time is right. We're really in a place now where if we can change people's habits, we can really get out in front of melanoma diagnoses and, hopefully not have to do so much work on the drug research side if we do a better job preventing it in general. So yeah, we are very committed to, looking at better options. We'd also like to make sure that, even kids in school have the opportunity to use it. It's often been, a barrier because sunscreens are considered a drug, and not easy for kids to use on their own at schools. So we want to break down these barriers and make sure everybody, in any place that they are of all ages has access and understanding and just ease of use of sunscreen.
Thank you very much, Dana. And as the dialogue continues at National Press Club for our folks online, but to wrap up this panel, it's very important for you to understand this. And Ed Hickey hit this point right on the head. We believe there ought to be a more holistic view in terms of policy, regulatory, and payment about the person who's involved. And when you talk about transplant patients and the gift of life that we receive, it's not simply the drugs that are immunosuppressives that help us maintain our organ. It's many other factors about our lives as people, our greater risk to skin cancer, and that's why we work diligently in many different types of coalitions to keep advancing what could be the next generation of drugs and preventatives. It's very, very important. And for some Americans like us, it's extremely important. The government doesn't view these things as disconnected efforts. They're about whole people. And when you look at people like us as transplant patients, we represent the suffering and we represent the gifts of many, many people that came before us. We work to honor our donors. And that's why Dr. Newell, Jonathan, and Dana are so important to our efforts. And I'd like to thank each of them.